Hi everyone, how are you today? Well, this will be the second and last installment of my review of My Ántonia by Willa Cather. I didn't realize when I started this video series that the first part of the book is pretty much the first half of the book, and then the other videos, or I should say the other parts, are very short and make up the second half of the book. So it doesn't really make sense to do a video on each one. I'm just going to give you my thoughts on parts 2 through, how many are there? 5? 2 through 5, I think it is. Before we get into that though, and well, we're back with the scratch art as well, I want to read this description that book 1 ends with, a description of a beautiful thunderstorm. And this is Jim speaking, of course, the narrator. I used to lie in my bed by the open window, watching the heat lightning play softly along the horizon, or looking up at the gaunt frame of the windmill against the blue night sky. One night there was a beautiful electric storm, though not enough rain fell to damage the cut grain. The men went down to the barn immediately after supper, and when the dishes were washed, Ántonia and I climbed up on the slanting roof of the chicken house to watch the clouds. The thunder was loud and metallic, like the rattle of sheet iron, and the lightning broke in great zigzags across the heavens, making everything stand out and come close to us for a moment. Half the sky was checkered with black thunderheads, but all the west was luminous and clear. In the lightning flashes it looked like deep blue water, with the sheen of moonlight on it. And the mottled part of the sky was like marble pavement, like the quay of some splendid sea-coast city, doomed to destruction. Great warm splashes of rain fell on our upturned faces. One black cloud, no bigger than a little boat, drifted out into the clear space unattended and kept moving westward. All about us we could hear the felty beat of the raindrops on the soft dust of the farmyard. So that's the scene which closes out book 1. There's a little bit of dialogue after it as well, but this magnificent thunderstorm kind of bookends this part of Jim's life, his childhood, and ushers in with, a little bit of foreboding as a thunderstorm has with it, this new chapter of his life. So book 2 goes into what happens 3 years later. Jim's family, his grandparents, have been living on their farm for, with him for 3 years now, and then they decide to move to town, the town of Black Hawk. And with that brings some changes for Jim as well. He no longer has, all the leisure time in the world. He has now been sent to school in Black Hawk and has to apply himself accordingly. And so that's what happens to Jim. And by the way, there are going to be spoilers in this video, obviously, as I comment on the last part of the book. But hopefully if you've read it, maybe you can chime in with your thoughts. Or, maybe for those of you who don't mind spoilers, this will encourage you to read the book. But yeah, things pick up quite a bit in part 2. The pace changes, the setting expands. We are introduced to new characters in Black Hawk. And of course there's old characters as well. Ántonia gets a job working as a cook for Jim's neighbors, the Harlings. They're Norwegians, and they are looking for a new cook, and so Jim's grandmother helps her get a job with them. The story is a little bit soapy, just a little bit soapy, because the kids are getting older now, and as mid to older teenagers, they're starting to have their little romances and things, and find ways to entertain themselves outside of school or working hours. And they end up taking dancing lessons from this traveling dancing instructor, and that's like the beginning of the dances in Black Hawk, which become a center of community life there. At least for the young set. Some of the older set as well. One of the things that I thought was very touching was how Cather describes the dancing lessons as a place for all people to come and learn So even some of the farmers out in the country, they drive over on Saturday night and participate. It's not really limited to the upper classes or anything. It's just anyone who wants to show up and learn to dance. And it's really sweet and wholesome, at least at the beginning. And this is where the book really, I think, starts to pick away at this sort of idyllic vision we have of pioneer life back in the day, and starts to show us how difficult it really was, especially for a young woman living at this time. And going to town just complicates life. It doesn't make it easier. Ántonia discovers that there's this fine line between propriety and impropriety. And as one of the hired girls, which is the name of this part of the book, she is viewed with more suspicion than the more genteel young ladies of the town. And, you know, it's not necessarily her own behavior that's at fault or anything, but just the hired girls being any of these young women that come in from the prairie, or they're immigrants, or both, and they, you know, have maybe less scruples about who they hang out with or where they go. And, you know, some of them are really into flirting and encouraging the young men to flirt with them or dance with them or whatever. You know, to varying degrees of impropriety. I would say that most of it's pretty harmless as described in the book, but, you know, obviously that raises some eyebrows in the town. And it gets to the point, sadly, that Ántonia gets in trouble for some of the people she's hanging out with. She's not done anything untoward, but some of her friends and acquaintances have. And the Harlings, who have hired her to be their cook, they just can't, they're not going to deal with that, and they tell her she's got to quit dancing and hanging out with this crowd, or she's got to go work somewhere else. And Ántonia is a, you know, she's a very lively girl. She wants a social life, and, you know, cooking for this family day in and day out, not having many joys in life. She's like, I just can't do that. I can't give up dancing just because, you know, somebody I know did something untoward. So she goes to work for this other couple who, unfortunately, are pretty much the only options around for employment. But they are this couple named Wick Cutter and his wife. And Wick is a very predatory person. So Jim's family is worried about that, obviously. But yeah, the Harlings just let her go work there rather than put up with her dancing and so on. This is, again, where the book kind of steps it up in tone. You know, previously there were certainly some dark elements in the book in the first part, especially with the story of the Russian immigrants. But now things are starting to get more dangerous for Ántonia, but not in such an overt way as in, you know, she's facing off wolves or whatever, but just what she has to do to have a life in town, or life at all really, is quite troubling. And I think that what Cather does well here is she doesn't get to, you know, it's not like there's like some super, well, actually there is one really dramatic scene later in this part of the book, but it's just kind of undercurrents. It's not even just, you know, Wick Cutter and his behavior, but it's the way, you know, other people react or don't react to the situation, and how poor Ántonia and girls like her are more often than not blamed for the behavior of other people. So there's this really strong, pointed message about that in the book, and yet delivered in such a way that you can see exactly how it happens, and it's not preachy, it's descriptive, it's realistic, and it just really makes you think, you know, about what it was like to live back then as a young woman, especially an immigrant woman. So yeah, the town offers new experiences, but also more opportunity for problems, and there's more rules to follow. Women are, in particular, hit very hard by all this, and young men, old men take advantage of them, and, you know, it often falls on the women's shoulders, the outcome of all this. And so I found there to be some very dark undertones here. Now, book 3 shifts focus again. It expands the setting once more because Jim finishes his studies in Black Hawk and he goes to college in Lincoln, Nebraska. So he's far away from Black Hawk, but he meets up with an old acquaintance named Lena Lingard. She's one of the Norwegian hired girls, and she's made a life for herself as a dressmaker, which is ironic because Lena was one of the more free-spirited girls in Black Hawk, one might say, perhaps misbehaving at times, but Jim finds this bitter irony unfold where that Lena has come into her own, she's respectable, she has a business, whereas Ántonia back in Black Hawk ends up having a baby with a very, we'll say, unserious man. Really a cruel man is how I would put it. And she gets jilted right before marriage. So, and Jim, I will say, does not do much growing up. One of the things that did frustrate me with this novel is how his judgments and opinions don't really change a whole lot from when he's a kid. He's becoming more and more disconnected from his childhood, from the town he grew up in. But he kind of retains this detached, judgmental attitude towards it all, as if he knows better. And, oh, that Ántonia, why didn't she just make better choices in life, And that's kind of his his attitude. Now, granted, it comes out of a place of love, I think. He does care for Ántonia as a friend. Still, he does seem very judgmental at times. And his own life is not picture perfect. He becomes increasingly lonely away from home, and he makes new friends and gets new mentors and stuff, but it's just not quite the same. I mean, he doesn't really find what he's looking for in these new experiences, even though they do open up a lot to him in terms of intellectual ideas and experiences, like going to the theater. No, that was a very fun scene in this part of the book where he talks about going to the theater with Lena. So that's Jim, and then the last two books are called The Pioneer Woman's Story, and the last book's called Cusack's Boys. And this kind of just sums up what happens to Ántonia, who's left behind in Black Hawk. And I will say that, the book was veering towards a Thomas Hardian tragedy, and I really thought it was just going to end like that, with, Ántonia being a single mother and everything. But Cather saves the book from complete bleakness by giving her a happy ending and helping her find love with another Romanian immigrant who, he's not the perfect man or anything, but they get along well, they understand each other, and he's committed to letting her live the life she wants to live, which is just being a simple farm girl. I say farm girl, but she ends up having a massive family and becoming a matriarch in her own right. So I liked that. Not every book has to end with overwhelming bleakness. It wasn't so, tidy that there were no frayed edges at the end. Obviously, her marriage wasn't perfect either, but it was nice that, Cather was trying to give her heroine something of a peaceful ending, a contentment at least. And that was lovely. I think it was lovely to see both Lena and Ántonia find lives that were fulfilling to them. And, perhaps Ántonia ended up being the happier of the two, even though she wasn't as well off. But she knew what she wanted in life, and in spite of some mistakes, ended up where she needed to be. So, it's a very satisfying ending to this novel, and certainly one I didn't see coming necessarily. But yeah, there's some subtle commentary here as well, such as the fact that she ends up settling down with someone who is from her own culture and, speaks the same language. And it just kind of paints this picture of, this family traveled so far to make a new life in America, and not everything turns out the way they might have expected, but they still managed to find some kind of happiness, and, they're able at least to make choices of their own, and I think that's something that comes out pretty clearly in the book. What I want to end with here too is just a reflection on Jim Burton as the narrator. I remember when I started this book, and as I explained in the previous video, Jim was not the original narrator of the story, and I do not know who it was supposed to be. One of the female characters, I think, but that's just a theory of mine. And so, looking back on the book, I can see now why Cather's editor recommended the perspective of Jim Burton. For one thing, he does give a layer of detachment from the characters. Now, some people have found this to be not very engaging, or it just seemed unnecessary, but I think given the time and place Cather wrote this novel in, it actually makes a lot of sense. Many readers of the time might not have felt comfortable or like accepting of, you know, maybe the main character being Romanian or otherwise one of these, you know, hired girls. But putting Jim as the narrator kind of gives us like space between those characters and the reader, which maybe we don't care about today, but, you know, back then would have made the point of view a little more palatable to the audience. But I think also it says some things about growing up. So we see Ántonia grow up, but we also see Jim grow up. And it kind of is interesting how so many of his attachments, attitudes, and flaws are formed when he's a child. And he doesn't really ever get fully challenged on them, and so he never fully grows out of them. That being said, he does manage to find some level of contentment by the end of the novel. And you know, it's definitely bittersweet. There's a lot he leaves out. There's a lot of years he doesn't even tell us about. It's because it's really him reminiscing about his youth. But I did feel like Jim, as the narrator, did add something to the book in these multiple ways. And I think adds a bit more dimension to this coming-of-age story. You know, things are messy. People are messy. The narrator, as much as anyone else, is involved in this messiness. So anyway, all in all, I just thought My Ántonia was one of the best books I read this year, and surprisingly just very thought-provoking. Had a very strong set of messages and ideas in it, but written in such a way that just drew you in and didn't preach, and I just loved that. I would love to read some more of her pioneer novels at some point. I might give it a little bit of a break, but I just think she's a very skilled writer, and this is some of the best American literature I've read so far. So if you've read it, let me know your thoughts, and I will see you in my next review. Bye.